I'll often ask leaders about, how are you understanding the employee experience? And I once got a response from a dean along the lines of, well, I feel like I know my employees pretty well because I stop by their offices all the time while I'm walking around the building. And I think that's great. I don't have anything against that. But, the likelihood that some staff member is going to really open up about their experience to the dean when they pop into their office is pretty low.
Welcome to Mission of Missions. I'm your host, Jeremy Tears. This is the show designed to help you grow, both professionally and personally, in the fast-paced world of higher education. Every other Tuesday, I sit down with senior leaders, new professionals, and difference makers from across higher ed and beyond, where we'll share tips and strategies related to challenging topics like student recruitment, leadership, customer service, enrollment marketing, and time management. So if you're looking for practical advice and conversations that actually move the needle, this show's for you. Grab your notepad or fire up your notes app, and let's get into it. Hey everybody, it's Jeremy Tears, and it's time to kick off season 6 of my Mission Admissions podcast with episode number 80. Joining me today is Dr. Kevin McClure, professor of higher education and chair of the Department of Educational Leadership at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I'm sure some of you listening saw Kevin speak back at the AMA conference in November, or you may have read or heard about his best-selling book, which is called The Caring University, which focuses on transforming the campus workplace for employees, a topic that together, Kevin and I are going to dive into today. So welcome to the show, Kevin.
Very excited to be here. Episode 80. Whoa, that's no joke.
We're getting there, and supposedly most people don't get anywhere close to 100. So I'm always excited to continue to do the pod, and it has been a fun journey to this point, without question. I am excited to unpack what I know so many people listening to this pod are dealing with on a daily basis, especially if they're at the leadership level, but even if they're not, and they're thinking about wanting to eventually move up the ladder in higher ed. And so, Kevin, here's where I would love to start. Why do you think the employee experience continues to be, I'll say, such a low priority in so many of the strategic plans for colleges and universities?
I think there's a couple of dimensions to this. One is tradition. We have a tradition in higher education of largely writing strategic plans or strategic priorities around a set of outcomes, ones that often connect to academic excellence, revenue generation, or student experience. And it's often not been the case that we included employees or considered employees to be themselves either part of the strategy or in themselves, their experience a strategic priority. We might be able to say that we've kind of taken for granted the fact that we're always going to have people that are here, that are showing up, that are ready to work, or if they're not, that we're going to be able to easily replace them. And so we could kind of get away with not really prioritizing the employee experience. So I think that's a piece of it. I think the second piece of it is, for the better part of the last 2 decades, so much of higher education has been oriented around the student experience. And so long as everything that we were doing was oriented around our ability to recruit students, our ability to educate students, our ability to graduate students, it kind of didn't matter what the costs were to people.
So what ultimately was the tipping point for you where you said this book has to be written, like we're at X point, whatever X point is?
So here's what happened. I had started kind of dabbling in some of my public writing in questions related to burnout and morale of higher education employees, some considerations of leadership. And through that writing, was able to do interviews with people. And this was happening at the same time as the pandemic and happening the same time as what came to be popularly known as the Great Resignation. And I'm someone who's an observer of higher education. I'm a participant in higher education, of course, but also part of my job as someone who teaches and studies colleges is to pay attention to what's going on in higher ed. And I just saw and heard so much pain everywhere. There wasn't really a great resource to help us tackle some of these questions that I was hearing from people over and over again. And just kind of this nagging sense, and I'm certainly not the only person who felt this way, right? There's lots of people I think who felt this way, but just nagging sense that certainly we can do this better. We have so many tools at our disposal. We have so much expertise. We have institutions that are really, in some cases, set up to develop people, to help people be at their best. Why in the world are we getting this so wrong? Shouldn't we be like a world leader as a workplace? Once I arrived at the idea that, okay, I think there's something here, I want to write a book about this, I couldn't write it fast enough. I just woke up every day with this feeling, this urgency that if this does not come out soon, there's going to be more pain, there's going to be more problems. Not to say that the publication of this book is going to solve all these things, but I did feel that this was something that absolutely had to come out, and the sooner the better.
What do you think is the root cause of burnout for most people?
There are many people who would point to a World Health Organization definition that says burnout is basically an occupational syndrome, which is to say it's something that we experience within organizations, principally within the workplace, and it's as a result of chronic stress. And so the idea is that stress is normal. We should go through a stress cycle where our stress is elevated. Maybe, early on in human history, we were running away from some sort of predator. Heavy amount of stress, that was a good thing because it helped us escape. But at some point, we were able to escape. The predator is no longer in the picture, and we're able to come down off of that stress, and it kind of completes the cycle. And what many researchers of burnout say is we reach a point of burnout when we don't ever complete that cycle, and we're at a point of elevated stress for too long. So there are some folks, some writers and researchers, for example, who say burnout is, yes, about stress, but it's also about a choice that we make when we encounter that stress. And we might say, okay, I need to get out of this moment, pivot out somehow. Or do we say, by virtue of my values, I'm going to keep going. I have hit the wall. And instead of saying, you know what, I'm not going to climb the wall, I'm going to leave, we say, I'm going to try to climb this wall because I think that this is the most important thing for me to be doing right now. So that's where it's been interesting to see kind of that additional layering of how we do bring our values into this as well. And there is something about folks who might be in service type occupations like education and healthcare, where when we are in that situation of elevated constant stress, instead of figuring out a way to kind of pivot out of that, we say, I have students to show up for, I have colleagues I care about, the mission of this really matters to me. And so therefore, I'm just going to keep going until I collapse. And I think there has been, since the pandemic, a increase in the number of people who experience that, who are deciding to continue at it. And so we may not be in what we think of as the Great Resignation or the peak of the Great Resignation, but the conditions that led to that are still at play, I think, even if people are making a different set of labor market choices.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. The conditions are there, and I feel like, and I'd love to get your take on this, I feel like some of these conditions, though, Kevin, are self-inflicted, right? I mean, I look at the org structures, for example, of so many different, campus departments. And obviously I see admissions and marketing departments, more than I do other parts of campus. But like employee workload, like for example, like colleges are notorious for having multiple people do what I would argue are multiple full-time jobs. And I don't believe it's sustainable. Like you said, you can hit a wall and you'll power through if you have, I'll say, a very clear why and a passion for all the stuff that you hit on. But like, how much of what you think is this stress is something that if we could change maybe the org structure, or we could do something different in terms of the way we just structure a whole bunch of things in the workplace, might alleviate some of the stress?
Well, you're hitting on basically a big premise of my book, which is that a significant amount of this is self-inflicted, which is to say, yes, there are individual choices at play here. So that's one piece of this, that you and I make choices day to day that have ramifications for our health and how we're feeling on the job. There are also kind of these external forces at play where, you know, political changes, policy changes, those have some real ramifications on our work, and that can be a source of stress as well. We have a tendency, though, to focus too much on those things in higher ed. Like that becomes our explanation for everything or our excuse for everything. And a big piece of this book for me was to say, we can't rely so heavily on those explanations. We need to be looking at what we are doing as organizations. We make choices all the time. And some of those choices are in response to real pressures, but nevertheless, we often have multiple pathways in front of us. And we don't have to choose a pathway over and over again that is harmful to people or is exploitative, it squeezes people. I'm in a situation now, even as a department chair, where I can see this. You know, we have goals as a college. We are measuring ourselves against a set of metrics. And through those metrics and through the pursuit of those goals, we are able to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. And I just recently said, you know, I'm not opposed to moving in this direction. We can't do all these things at the same time, and we can't do them all in one semester. We're going to have to make some choices about what we want to prioritize and lay out a plan. And we are going to have to do this kind of bit by bit, because otherwise there's going to be some real cost to people. And I don't think that helps us in the long term.
So I'll ask you the same question. I feel like I've probably asked a dozen yes in all these episodes, Kevin, because I absolutely want to get your take on this. Why does higher ed struggle with change so much?
So I have 1,000 different responses to this. So I'll pick a couple and we'll go with it. Okay, so here's one take, which is, I don't actually think that higher ed struggles to change in quite the same way that people think. I think that we're changing all the time. However, people have competing visions of what that change should be. And so it's not always the case that we're moving in the direction that someone thinks we should be moving. But anytime you're on a campus, I mean, we are dealing with change constantly. It is a never-ending cycle of change. It may just not be change in the right direction. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is, first of all, we should be pretty clear about what kind of language or what kind of change we're talking about. We're talking about change in the right direction. We're talking about change that's entered into intentionally and not something that's foisted upon us. And in many cases, what's being asked of us is transformational change. It's not just kind of the day-to-day kind of stuff. And that is the hardest, is change that is at the level of our culture, change that's at the level of our structures. And part of the reason why I think that we're bad at it is, first of all, we don't always craft a compelling why for the people who are going to be tasked with carrying out that change. So people are left with questions around why this and not that, why this versus continuing to do what we have already done. And we kind of skip that step. We go right into the here's what we're doing and how we're going to do it, and not the this is the reason why we think this is the right thing to do. The second thing is we don't build in enough opportunity for people to make sense of change and what it means for them. And so again, we kind of jump right into the tactics of it without necessarily allowing someone to make meaning of it and to say, okay, let me wrap my head around this a little bit. Let me ask questions. Can I ask questions of this and see if I can get some answers to them? And unfortunately, it's often staff in particular who get skipped right over with that opportunity to kind of put forth questions. Can I be skeptical for a second and say, okay, here's the concern I have about this. And then to have somebody take that seriously and to say, let's work through this and let's arrive at a place, hopefully, where we've got a better understanding of how we've chosen to go down this path. I'll end by saying the actual execution of change is extremely hard. I don't care who you are and how gifted you are. You may be the best explainer of a change in the world and a great communicator. You may have great relationships. The execution of change is incredibly difficult. And we often task that or give that task to people who are already trying to keep the trains running. And in many cases, we probably need dedicated people on campuses who are trained, who have a number of different approaches in their tool belt that they can pull from. Their whole job is basically to lead change on campus. And so bring in some additional capacity. And that could be externally, but it could be at larger campuses. They do have, in some cases, teams of people who've been tapped to kind of help lead us through this. And I personally think that that's not a bad investment.
If a leader listening to this, Kevin, is like, okay, well, then what are some of the ways that I, as a senior leader, can make, just in my group, the employee experience more of a strategic priority, even if it's not being prioritized as much by my institution as I'd like? Like, where would you tell them to start?
There are a couple of first step pathways that I usually recommend. And, one of those, I think, is to make sure that you yourself have a grounding and why this matters to you. And try as best you can to articulate that to yourself. And by doing so, you might be able to then articulate it to other people and convince other people around you around why you think this matters. There is a certain dimension of this work that I do, of this entire concept of the caring university, where people say, yeah, I'm going to get on board with that. Why not? I'll be excited, but we're sure we should treat our people well. And I want to subscribe to this idea, but there's no substance behind that. It's an easy thing to jump on board with, but I think some of this kind of comes down to the level of like, you as a leader, what are your values? And ultimately, why do you think it's worth pursuing this? And so you should be able, I think, to point out, here are the reasons why I think caring for my people, investing in my people is really important for what we're trying to accomplish. The second thing is we often operate, I think, with too little understanding of what people experience on the job. And sometimes that's because our data isn't great. Sometimes our data is non-existent on this. And so I'll often ask leaders about, how are you understanding the employee experience? And I once got a response from a dean along the lines of, well, I feel like I know my employees pretty well because I stop by their offices all the time while I'm walking around the building. And I think that's great. I don't have anything against that. But, the likelihood that some staff member is going to really open up about their experience to the dean when they pop into their office is pretty low. And so we need some ways of listening at the scale of the organization so that we have a better sense of what people are experiencing, how much they are working, and what are some sources of stress. And through that, we can maybe identify a couple of areas where we're going to prioritize. And that's where we have an obligation to close the feedback loop. We can't just collect this information and then say, okay, cool, I guess I have some understanding now, and then leave it at that and carry on. We have to then take some piece of that and say, here's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that our recognition system is unfair. And so we're going to work on improving that. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's the timeline for it. We're going to report out the progress that we're making. And then ultimately, we're hopefully going to come up with a solution or a new recognition system. It doesn't solve every problem, but it's a starting point. And it shows people that by participating in that effort to give feedback, it actually materializes. It changes things. And if we don't do that, if we don't ever close the loop, then it's real easy for people to say, I'm out. I don't need to participate in this in the future. And so I think that's a great starting point, is to really ask, what do I know? How well do I understand this? Because I think that will open a few doors to say, here might be a next first step for us, or a next step where we can take action on this. We can repeat the process or go back into that data and say, okay, here's another step. And we're going to keep chipping away at this over time in such a way that signals that this isn't like a one-day staff appreciation sort of thing, that this is an ongoing part of how we operate.
Let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. Forsyth Tech was struggling to engage prospects promptly. Staff were overwhelmed and leads were slipping through the cracks. Then they brought in Element 451's Bolt agents. These AI-powered assistants stepped in to answer inquiries, send reminders, schedule visits, and route leads day or night. As a result, prospect to applicant conversion hit 25% within 3 weeks, and enrollment rose 12%. The impact? Counselors focused on high-value conversations while Bolt agents handled the rest. Fast response, higher yield, happier staff. Support your counselors with 24/7 AI teammates. Try an agent today at element451.com/agents. Yeah, I love that you also really emphasize I'll call it follow through, or we'll go back to what you said earlier, the execution. And it is hard, but it is so important because, as employees, if you're going to ask for our input and feedback and then do nothing with it, why should we even give you the input and feedback then? Like what, so I wonder, and again, I would love to know just whether it's through all of your research or just, what you've seen and heard in your years in the industry. Is it literally just one-on-one and asking the right kinds of questions that really is the best way to obtain so much of that feedback, Kevin? Or do you find there are other ways for leaders to effectively solicit, I'll say, employee feedback on their experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I like about that question, it is a recognition that this is challenging. I think, yes, conversations can be very helpful so long as you really do feel like you've got the type of relationship that would enable an honesty to kind of come forth. And there's a piece of leadership that, frankly, in my view, is simply the art of noticing other people and noticing where problems exist. And so not all of this necessarily needs to live in like a formal data collection process. As long as we've got our eyes open and our heads up, we're present with the people that we're working with, we're listening, we're noticing where they're struggling. It's easy for us to kind of pick up on areas where we need to be thinking and improving. And then we could gather some of those and run them by our teams and to say, here's what I am noticing. Does this resonate? Is this something that we could be working on? And you can check it that way so that you're not making assumptions. But there are also other techniques. I mean, obviously, we've got university-based protocol or instruments that they'll sometimes use around campus climate or staff engagement. Those can provide some input. I don't love some of those instruments, not necessarily because I think that they are bad, but here's what ends up happening. We have to oftentimes aggregate the data to prevent people from being kind of individually identified, which makes perfect sense. In the process of aggregation, it is possible for the data to kind of get smoothed out. And all of a sudden, we look okay. We're not knocking it out of the park. We're not terrible. We're okay. We also do peer benchmarking, which has this tendency of kind of saying we're in the ballpark. And so there's not really an issue here. And so, but nevertheless, that is a possibility that through that, it could be the case that you maybe get some department level or college level data that signals, hey, there is a problem here. We are below the peers that we're being benchmarked against, and this is something that we could work on. Places are experimenting with pulse surveys, so more frequent, short surveys, still intended to be anonymous, where people can kind of say, this is what I'm experiencing. Or you can do a more department or college level initiative. We did a college level initiative to gather some data on that. Again, the intent, still anonymous, still a survey, but it was a little bit more specific, focused on our culture, some of the things that we already knew to be things that were challenges and that needed to work on. And then that allows for a type of specificity. There are, of course, check-ins that can happen with new employees. There are, real exit survey systems that can be helpful so long as they're actually utilized and practiced. A big problem that I think we have in higher ed is we sometimes set things up, but then we don't sustain them, or we collect the data and the data kind of gets squirreled away because people get nervous. And so having a good kind of policy in place around how is data shared, who has access to it, I think can be very beneficial because, again, we don't want this to be an exercise where folks in power get nervous about what's going to get shared. And so we kind of then hide it and it becomes counterproductive. Part of this, again, has to do with the prioritization in the sense of as an organization, we're going to be smarter and more selective about what we pursue. We're going to have meaningful conversations with people in leadership roles about their workload and to address workload issues that may arise there so that they've got time to be a manager and a people leader. We need to, I think, better recognize that people leadership is leadership. This is what we have tasked people with. It's not just moving the ball forward on a particular goal. It's also how we're constructing our teams, how we're motivating people, how we are retaining our talent, how we're attracting and recruiting people. This is the work of leadership. It's people-based, but unfortunately, so much of our time and our schedule has been filled with tasks and tactics that it makes it hard for that to be at the forefront. And so I really think this does have to be kind of an institution-wide conversation, part of the culture where we say we need to better ensure that people have time for this because it's good for us. It's good for our ability to achieve some of these goals. And that may start with us saying that instead of 10 strategic priorities, we've got 5.
Where does the onus lie then if I'm, let's just play a scenario out. If I'm a vice president of enrollment and I'm overseeing enrollment, marketing, financial aid, maybe student success, but I've clearly got a lot on my plate, regardless of where I am staffing wise. If my institution is not, I'll say, doing a lot of the things that we just spent some time discussing they should be doing, how much of it is, as a VP, I need to advocate more for myself to my senior leaders versus just saying, well, I'll cross my fingers and hope at some point somebody comes to me and solicits my feedback?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't want to trivialize the challenge at play because it's real. And some of the things that I'm talking about that I'd love to see happen, I think they're difficult to envision because—
What would you love to see happen?
Well, what I'd love to see happen is kind of the pursuit of what I think of as the caring university, which is a set of organizational changes that ensure that employees and their well-being is a strategic priority for the institution. And so moving in that direction is difficult. It's difficult for anybody that's, in a middle type position or a middle type position and higher, where you are responsible for a lot of people. And maybe you're doing so in the context of an institution that isn't prioritizing that, but you want to make this a hallmark of your leadership. And so that said, I do think that we all have kind of a zone. We have a scope where we're going to be able to carry some of this out. Yes, there are going to be moments where we hit a wall in terms of what we want to try to accomplish because the institution isn't moving in that direction. And that's where we have to recognize that maybe the best that we can do is try to advocate, try to push, try to find little instances where we're able to kind of bend the policy a little bit, or kind of shift mindsets with the people that we're working with to some extent. But then within our unit, within our division, we can play a role in kind of crafting and shaping the culture that we want to see. Through that, I think we can make a set of choices about how we interact with the people that we're working with day in and day out. How are we modeling supervision with our direct reports and the type of supervision that we expect them to have with the people below them? To what extent are we holding people accountable when there are clear violations of that culture? And that's another way that we're kind of modeling for others that we really take this seriously when we say, I'm not just talking about this. When I see someone clearly violating this, we're going to do something about it. And there are going to be times where the pressures from the institution become too much, in the sense that maybe you're overseeing enrollment and basically the marching orders are, we have to do this. And I know that that is going to squeeze people. And in those instances, I think it's okay for a leader to come forward and be honest and say, this is the goal that's been set for us. I have explained to them the reasons why I think this is going to be challenging, the resources that we need to carry it out. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I want you all to know, the people that I'm working with, that yes, this is the goal that's been set for us. We're going to try our very best. This is not the way that I would approach it. And try to bring a certain level of transparency to where you sit as an individual leader, even if you're within a context that's kind of pushing you in a direction that you think is going to pose some difficulties. It's not going to fix everything by any stretch of the imagination. People could still get squeezed. People could still leave. But it allows you to be clear on where you're at, and to say, I would like to try to do things differently. I'm going to keep on pushing for that. But this is the priority right now for the institution. This is what we're going to be aiming for. And we're going to do our best to support you through this, but we know it's going to be difficult.
It's so important for leaders to, I'll say, display clearly ways that they're supporting their team, right? Even if it's not always working out, just letting them know, because otherwise, right, we all make assumptions. We're all human. So the first assumption usually is, well, I'm sure my boss never went and talked to his or her boss. And so like this probably never made its way up the food chain. And like, next time I have a meeting, like why bother, right? And so I love that you hit on that. I would be curious to know, what are one or two other small changes that maybe you've seen a leader make that you feel like have had a big positive impact on like staff morale and engagement?
Well, I do want to I want to underscore that point that you made really quickly, because I think it's really important. We're in institutions that are incredibly hierarchical, they're bureaucratic. The assumption is that information travels down the chain and then it travels back up if it needs to. But we've got these lines of communication where there's a perfect flow of information. And so it doesn't work that way in reality. A leader may hope that this thing that they are conveying to their direct reports is then finding its way down to folks that are lower on the organizational chart. And so this is why it's really important, I think, for leaders to be telling people as much as possible in a full group setting or in a setting that allows it, not just relying on information to travel down the chain, because it won't. So if there's something critical about how you're approaching a challenge, something critical about your values as a leader that you want to make sure get articulated, you can't just rely on that getting passed down the chain. I do think that can be a really important step. Closing the feedback loop, like I said, is really important. That's a big piece of trust building. And so taking trust building really seriously, I think, matters. And the reason why closing the loop is so critical, I think, to that trust building step is people want to know that they can rely on you. Not just that your word matters, that's a piece of it, but also that you're going to be taking action. When you hear that they are struggling with something, that there's a problem and you're in a position to do something about it, they want to know that you're taking that information and then trying to come up with an action that's going to help us move the ball forward. And when they know that about you, when they know what your values are, they know that there's integrity in terms of alignment between what you're saying and the actions that you're taking, that's where I think we see more trust being able to bubble up. And that's huge for morale, because we can't control the stuff that's going to be thrown at us. There is going to be stuff that's thrown at us. There's no doubt about it. But then somebody can at least say, but I know you. I know you. I know what you're about. And I know that you're trying. And even as these things get thrown at us, I have a sense of what you're thinking and how you're going to respond. And that matters. I think that matters in terms of my ability to kind of keep going with this. We have to be willing and able to kind of focus and prioritize on relationship building within our teams, because I think that's a cornerstone of the type of resilience that we're going to need. And again, that's a big piece of motivation and morale as well. The institutions where we maybe see some movement, some real improvements in morale, again, they don't treat this as like a one-off thing. It's not like we have a wellness day or we had a wellness week in 2018, and then that's kind of it. It's the places that have kind of said, this is going to be part of what we do on an ongoing basis. We do it proactively. So it's not just something that we do reactively when we hear that there's kind of an uptick in turnover or we've already lost 10 people. We already are taking steps in this direction. And they're the places who treat, I sometimes talk about there being some illogical, absurd things that we do in higher education, especially in the higher education workplace. And I think places that are willing to kind of step up and say, that is absurd. We don't have to do it that way. We can fix this. Are places where people will say, okay, like I can again come to rely on this as a place that cares about me, cares about my experience here, and is willing to demonstrate that through its actions.
Kevin, the last thing I do in every podcast is something I call fun rapid fire. So I'm just going to give you a handful of things, and I want to get some quick feedback from you on each, okay?
All right, let's do it.
All right, you're a University of Richmond grad. Favorite spot that you hung out on campus, where was it?
I was a history major, and I did almost all of my work and writing from a tiny little computer lab in Jepson Hall, which was the home of the leadership studies major. I somehow got access to this computer lab, even though I'm not a major there, and I was the only one who ever used it. So it was my own little tiny antiquated nook on the beautiful University of Richmond campus. Also great for taking naps.
What's the last thing you searched on Google?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so here's the thing. I rely on Google to find my own institution's websites and policies on a regular basis. So there's a pretty good likelihood that I was Googling some sort of policy or website or information on my own campus's website, because I don't know how other people go about finding information, but I Google it.
If they made a movie about your life, what would the title be, Kevin?
We'll call it The Unlikely Professor.
And last one, whatever you're comfortable sharing, give me a big pet peeve that you have.
Ooh, I don't like people who get into email arguments and get, this time of year, this happens a little bit as a department chair where people get petty. And we've got, grade disputes that are going on and we're doing that sort of thing. We have a lot of petty arguments happen by email. And I usually just want to say, all right, people, step away from the keyboard. It's time to have a conversation. And then usually either with a little bit of distance or bringing people face to face, the ridiculousness of the stuff that we're arguing becomes clearer.
I appreciate everything that you shared today. I really encourage any of you listening who haven't read Kevin's book, The Caring University, to pick it up. I think you will all find a lot of value in it, and it will put you in thought and get you thinking, right? Which is what I feel like any good book does. It gets you thinking, all right, what can I do differently or do better? Kevin, I just appreciate you sharing all that knowledge and wisdom today, and I look forward to the next time we connect.
Awesome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks for listening to Mission Admissions. This show is a proud member of the Enrollify Network, home to Higher Ed's largest collection of podcasts. Enrollify is where higher ed goes to grow, so be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, video clips, blogs, and more. Visit enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and content drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com.